Oracle of the Forgotten, The Humans, The Wandering Swordsman, Part 2. The swordsman found his way north to chase a larger bounty than normal. While off his chosen route, he knew that it would bring him enough that he could travel without interruption on the next stretch of his journey. There were problems in this region with trolls, one of the few creatures that would attack during the day. In this case, being closer to the mountains meant the trolls likely had their own caves and coves to hide in. Odilon wandered north, moving closer to the edges of the mountains and further from his destination as he went. He followed the signs of broken trees and trails of remains of whatever the trolls had crushed on the way to and from their home. By now, he knew it all too well. The trolls had the most foul-smelling caves he had ever seen. It even rivaled some of the prison sewers that he had been put in to hunt small groups of bandits earlier in this journey. The cave was dark, dank, and filled with the bones and fleshy remains of previous victims. The trolls didn't always care to cook their prey, but they also didn't always tend to kill them. He could hear, rather than see, the women who'd been captured by the beasts. He didn't wish to think of the things the creatures had done to them. The odds were that a good many had already been killed by these animals and whatever torments they wished to bestow. Odilon had seen it too many times. Still, some part of him was starting to detach from caring about these people like he felt he should have. It didn't matter. Most of them were dead and dying, and he could not afford the distraction. The swordsman backed away from the scene, glancing around the dark and looking for signs of the trolls themselves. Up to this point, there was only the quiet stench of rot and the sound of suffering. Still, for a moment, there was nothing. Only a sudden sharp pain in his chest that he had come to know as a warning. He didn't have a moment to think. He only reacted at the sense and spun to draw his sword to face the new source of this disruption. Something behind him had shifted. It was hidden in the shadows, and he hadn't seen, but sensed it. What he sensed came crashing down where he had previously stood, with the full weight of a partial tree and mud-covered root ball that was being used as a mace. The cracking on the stone cavern floor reminded him the sound of broken bones. The force knocked the swordsman back. Rather than allow himself to fall, he moved with it, letting himself walk backwards with the force until he had better footing. Once there, he could feel the second presence looming behind him in the darkness. Trolls always did love to hunt in packs. It was a dark, sadistic grin that overcame him in the moment, though. Two in such tight quarters would struggle to move like they needed to, and that was all he needed to know. He would adapt as the challenges faced him. He moved back, taking advantage of the speed his smaller body could give him, and then rushed towards the creature behind him. The large beast stepped to the side, allowing his blade to cut into its leg, but mostly preserving the rotting green-black flesh of it. The scent of its blood was worse, though. The strange fluid seemed almost like sewage, thick, sticking to anything around it, and the smell was beyond all reason. Even the cloth wrapped around his face was hardly enough to block it. Right now he couldn't care. He ran past the beast, hoping to gain a better vantage point. His eyes narrowed in the darkness as he made out 2, then 3 outlines, each one hunched over and waiting for a chance at him. The one with the tree mace pulled the wounded one back, dragging his way past the troll to face the mortal itself. Again, it swung at him, this time sideways, figuring he couldn't dodge while so close to a cavern wall. This was a miscalculation that would cost the monster 2 of its fingers. The mortal ducked down, even with his huge blade in hand, and rushed towards the creature before him. As the mace breezed past his head, he heard it hit the ball. The 2 fingers that his blade had cut into quickly fell from the hand, leaving it unable to hold on. The mace bounced away from the wall, rolling a distance before coming to a stop on the ground nearby. The dust and dirt that filled the air were only the beginning. Flickering lights from a fire nearby, combined with the dust, had allowed a bit more light to reflect through the cave. He saw there were 5 in total. 5 trolls. Was a fairly good-sized clan of them, but still something felt off. This cave went off into the distance and deeper for some time. There was no way to tell the amount who were hiding there. Once he managed to dispatch all the trolls on the upper caves, he cut free one of the prisoners and handed her a knife he'd taken off the previous bounties. He told her to free the others and continued to make his own way through the caves. In total, he spent 6 days in those caves. Along his journey, he found bioluminescent mushrooms and moss that lit his way. The occasional flame or torch that the trolls used helped him to know which way they tended to wander, even though the smell had already tipped him off. 10 trolls later, the mortal managed to remove all 15 from this colony, one of the larger ones he'd ever seen in his travels. It wasn't a good sign. It meant that they were growing in numbers. He figured when he reported back for his pay, he would report the findings as well. But his first task had to be cleaning himself up. He noticed as he left the caverns that at least the living prisoners were no longer in the cave. He assumed it meant those who could have the chance to escape took it. With that, he collected the signs of his accomplishments and went on his way. Each troll had a special braid that only they seemed to know how to weave. The materials were from different excretions from the bodies of the troll. For this reason, fakes were uncommon, and he doubted any human would even try. He put the things into a leather pouch he had specifically bought to try to mask the scent of it all. Before returning to the city, he tended his wounds. An older one still remained from his days in the prison, a stark reminder of why he was doing this all, but he needed to get the stains of those beasts out of it before it ruined him. He repacked the wound and bandaged it. It had become more red around the edges, something he would get some ointment for later, but for now he had too many things to do. After turning in the bounty, the man listened to the local rumors. A half-demon was wandering these parts. While half-demons were not a new story, the fact that this one was apparently around for years was strange. Usually they disappeared and returned as proper demons sometime later. By then, they normally went on rampages through entire cities. It seemed this one turned up on occasion, chasing bounties or picking fights with members of the New Order. That last option he had some respect for, but the idea of a half-demon still disgusted him. He'd seen what demons could do in his time fighting them. For whatever reason, they seemed drawn to him along his path, and he'd encountered so many he was beginning to lose track. He'd been tipped off to the presence of some trolls along a nearby caravan route. While there wasn't actually a bounty for this, he figured he could barter for some supplies should he encounter one of the traders along his travels. He left in the morning, as he always did. His eyes were sharp and he was well fed. He still couldn't find a bed to sleep in as the inn was full. Still, the village was quiet and he'd managed to find somewhere to sleep. Along his path, he ran into a set of bandits. It didn't take long for him to remove them. After so long fighting beasts and demons, some mortals seemed easier than others. The road between the villages was 2 days' travel for most. He tended to move quickly, though, as long as there were no interruptions. He continued down the trail until he saw signs. A broken bit of wood here, a hole where a tree had been uprooted along the side of the road. After a short time he saw them, a troll carrying a sack full of women and children from one of the 2 broken wagons nearby. He quickly assessed the situation. The burning in his chest was followed by the now familiar whispers of his blade. The blade told him quietly that there were 6 trolls, and then 5, then 4. Something was killing them quickly. While that drew his curiosity, he needed to move. With trolls and the proof of a caravan, he was minimally hopeful that there might be some survivors. His goal was only to eliminate the trolls themselves. What he saw when he arrived was a solitary warrior. They were moving quickly, almost impossibly fast. It was hard to tell much about them other than they were mixing a spear fighting style with one of the sword styles he seemed to just inherently know from his childhood. The warrior was none other than the Dragoon Nalia. She had held her own fine against these trolls. She was lost in her own mind, though, determined to prove wrong the vision that all the occupants of this caravan had died. The change from her visions gave her hope, a fleeting light of it that seemed to distract her from the presence of the stranger who was never in her dreams at all. The human was in the way. This human was taller than most, not that she cared. His sudden rushing of her target had thrown her off her decided battle strategy to save the humans it had captured. As she watched, the human used his ridiculously large blade to cut down the troll, dropping it onto the ground where it rolled onto the sacks that it had held the survivors in. Nalia froze for only a second. Then she felt something burning within her that she hadn't felt in such a long time. It was cold. It was fire. And it was flaring through her entire being. She was enraged. Those people, those lives, they could have been saved, but him, he'd taken this chance of victory away from her. And the rage in her grew. Her eyes began turning a darker purple. The cold was waking something within her. The rage drew on her demonic presence within, and suddenly she heard a whisper in her own mind. "So now you call on me. I knew you would if I gave you time. Where are your precious morals now, child?" That presence she believed to be a demon, a voice that haunted her. Maybe it was her own demon blood screaming from within. Nothing mattered now. This swordsman, he had killed them. She was so certain she could have saved him. She wasn't aware of what was going on with him. She flickered, stepping in and out of the shadows and the realm of demons itself. She wasn't aware of how far her own presence had fallen in her grief. The opportunity didn't seem to come. Rather, he raised his blade, turning to counter her as she circled him. It was as if he were fully aware of every movement she had made. Maybe he's a sorcerer. It was her own thoughts, but that suspicion led to something else. First, no magic worker had the power to wield a sword that heavy, but if he was... She grinned before her entire form exploded into shadows. It shattered across the path, dusting the surface as it swirled upon the wind. A moment later, she appeared behind him, and in that instant she swung her spear. It should easily have struck him, but instead, she found herself in a battle she wasn't quite expecting. Her spear was caught upon his blade, and now she was partially visible to him. Her demonic powers were limited by her own mortality, but this man clearly knew exactly where she was the entire time. "That's impossible." The words slipped from her lips as her own confusion began to melt her rage. She stepped back, her spear lowering slightly to her side as she fully reformed into the mortal realm. "You can see?" Her amethyst eyes studied this human. He was something else, something she'd never encountered before. For a brief moment, she had forgotten why she even had come to this place. "Demons will be destroyed." It was dark, cold, Almost like an incantation falling from his lips, he rushed towards her. He was faster than she expected, but not quite faster than the smaller-framed half-demon. This seemed to her like a test. His blade swung wildly as he approached her, making her uncertain of exactly how he intended to strike. She stepped aside at the last moment, bypassing his blade before slamming the pull of her spear roughly against his ribs. The mortal spun back, growling in rage and pain. His stance was off. Her strike against him shouldn't have created the level of pain she was reading from his hidden expressions. She could almost sense it scattering upon his energy now. That wasn't what caught her attention the most. She was still mostly engulfed in her own inner demon. She could sense something. Something about this human was gnawing at her senses. Something about him was wrong. Every one of her immortal senses, that demon voice within her that had goaded her for so many years, screamed loudly, "Kill him, destroy him. Destroy everything he is. He doesn't deserve to live." She was growing uncomfortable with it. The cold rage of the voice, the ancient song that was growing louder in her mind, a chanting that was threatening to devour her from within. Destroy the mortal. She focused on the energy again as he was gaining his bearings. She could tell he was observing her for some sort of reaction or her next attack. She anxiously twisted a golden ring that rested on one of her horns as she continued to study him. She needed to understand, why did she suddenly wish to destroy him with all of her being? That's when she realized. That's when she knew. On his chest, the left side, she could feel the blue fires burning within him. She could sense the draw from the void itself. She felt something screaming loudly inside of her. He was void-marked. She knew now. This was how he knew where she was. They were both tied to the void, like it or not. "You're injured." It was a flat observation, her attempt at trying to distract him while she continued studying him. She needed to know what was happening here. Odilon stood observing the demon. He could tell she sensed something in him. She was studying him so intently it almost enraged him all by itself. It wasn't the same study he'd received from other females of her kind. It wasn't perverse, it was inquisitive, like she'd been sizing him up. He took the brief opportunity to realize his situation. She'd been fighting the trolls, trying to rescue the occupants of this caravan, but why? Demons do not care about mortals. He placed his hand on his now aching ribs a moment before launching himself at her again, this time rushing her with such a force it should have cracked her form in two. Yet the strike didn't reach her. Rather, his blade crashed into the ground, breaking the packed dirt around them and forcing it into the air. She'd stepped back from the reach of the blade and stood where the dirt had pushed her even further back from the force of its presence. "You're injured." This was the second time she said it. Instead of facing him, the woman spun and began to walk away from him. She turned her back on him, like so many of them did. She refused to fight him. The mortal could feel his anger growing. They were all so arrogant, every single one of them. He forgot about his attempts to figure out why she seemed so different. In that moment, he wanted her to acknowledge what he could do. His mind screamed what his lips did not. "Am I so unworthy of you, turning your back on me? Am I unworthy of your notice? Do you really think I cannot destroy you?" Still, the words never escaped him. He was trying to assess how to deal with this new tactic this demon seemed to use. It was definitely different from the others. She quickly walked to the overturned wagon, where she found a man who was still living among the wreckage. For a moment, she had hope again, the smallest glimmer of hope. He'd been there a while. Could he even be saved? She knew she had to try. But as she approached, the man lifted a small object. A thunderous clap, and then a single round of powder-charged metal fired forth. It blew through her armor and her shoulder with just as much ease. Firearms were a newer development, meant to fight beasts, but it didn't matter. She felt the pain sear through her body, but all she wanted to know about was this mortal. "Are you in pain? How can I help you?" Her words seemed to take back the swordsman who was observing her. The tradesman, still pinned under the wagon, didn't seem nearly so impressed. He continued clicking the now empty device, as if trying to fire it off again and again. He'd probably used the other rounds on the trolls. She reached for it, taking the firearm from his hand gently with her left hand, the same arm which she had been shot through. "Let me help you." She could sense the swordsman moving closer. She figured it was only a matter of time before he was attacking her again. After all, he seemed determined to dispatch her. The human she was trying to help began to panic, pulling himself as far as he could away from the wagon. Despite her insistence that he should stop, the man seemed to have fully detached himself from the reality of the situation. His adrenaline was guiding him, not his own mind. The half-demon rushed to try to stop him, ignoring his protests. If she could get to him, she knew that she could help. The man had taken pressure off the wound from one of his legs. It had mostly severed beneath the wagon, and the movements pulled the wound even wider. Without help, he would be gone quickly. She fought the man's hands, trying to push him away so that his bleeding could be stopped. She continued attempting until he was too weak to fight back. Then she tried to place enough pressure on the wound that her magic could, hopefully, have any chance of keeping him alive. She was unaware of the state of the mortal behind her now. He had been watching, feeling the strangest sense of confusion he'd ever experienced. This was not demon behavior. He eventually made up his mind. Even though she was trying to save this mortal, it was probably a trick. After all, if she could save him, she would have an indebted servant. She struggled a time, covered in the blood of the traveler. By now she'd expended quite a bit of energy just trying to save him. Still, she realized there was nothing she could do. His soul had slipped between her fingers, and she could feel it escaping into the aether. She was still kneeling when she heard the mortal's voice. As she started to listen to his words, she began to stand up slowly, her back still turned to him. "Am I that fucking beneath you? Turn around and face me, demon." Odilon was certain that this was somehow a trick. It was only a matter of time before she turned on him. He was waiting for it. What he didn't expect was the response. "A demon. That's all your kind ever sees. A demon." She muttered softly before turning and looking at him, her voice growing a little louder as she spoke. Even though the light was slowly fading from her eyes the longer she continued. No, she was fading. Her fighting spirit was fading so quickly. A demon who tried to spare the life of a caravan's women and children to save this survivor. She suddenly lowered her voice. "I'm not a demon. I'm a failure." Her eyes lowered. She could sense more than see his attack coming, and she refused to move. His blade would be her punishment. After all, she deserved it by now. How many people had she let die? His swing had already been in motion when he realized what was happening. He could have hit her. He could have struck down the monster, and yet, for the life of him, all he could see was the crushing sadness that had wrapped around this young woman. He growled in frustration, along with the effort to drag the heavy blade to the side. It grazed her, knocking down a strap of her armor and grazing her form. Even so, it wasn't enough to do any lasting damage. You could have killed me. You would have been in the right, too. She was now looking at him, head tilted in her own confusion. She should be dead. They shouldn't be standing here talking. She wasn't even sure now what to say. You are void-marked. Demons cursed your entire life, yet you spare me? Her confusion was all too clear, and the human wasn't too keen on this situation himself. You're injured. It was a fitting retort, though. He was angry, but he was the one granting her mercy now. This had changed the dynamic of power between them. She stuck her finger deep into the hole in her shoulder. The agony of the wound was a small comfort to the woman, though. After all, she was still alive. Maybe she could redeem herself. Malia finally lowered her hand and spoke. I suppose you're right. What will you do with me, then? She couldn't help but notice so many things about him now that they weren't fighting. Muscular, fit, familiar in some strange sense she couldn't quite understand. When he didn't respond by doing anything other than raising the sword with one hand rested on his shoulder, she sighed. Come on, I'll patch you up and we can kill each other later. It was a compromise, after all. They were on equal ground for now. She continued to speak. If you can trust a demon, I know a place that's safe. Her thoughts were still haunting her, blaming her for the deaths. With a bit more talking and his continued silence, the woman explained the location she had in mind was nearby. An hour past it was a village if he didn't care about traveling in the dangers of the night. He didn't speak even then. Instead, he followed her back to the path. Despite her injuries, the woman still fought well. She cleared most of the path of spirits and beasts on their way to this destination. When he finally asked for an introduction, she told him, Nalia de Tau, Shade of the Kingsguard Dragoons. He understood what it meant, but for a demon to be among the purest warriors in the land was laughable at best. The fact that she led him to a temple belonging to the old church was even more confusing to the human. She explained that the wards were broken and could no longer keep her kind out. It required faith, but it also required a power most mortals lost long ago. Still, as they walked through the entrance, the walls shook slightly. The sound of crackling and rattling seemed to surround them as well, as the dust, while a few more stray rocks fell from the partially collapsed ceiling. As soon as they were inside, she went to work, building up the old wards around the temple and activating the ancient sigils and spells that had once protected the occupants. Even he could feel the shift as the wards snapped back into place. He couldn't help but notice the process had lit one of her hands on fire, burning up her arm before it finally settled itself. The flames dimmed on their own, but had left some visible wounds in their wake. She offered to tend his wounds if he moved to the medical station at the back of the old building, then realized he had never told her his name. He began to demand answers, to which she only replied that he hadn't even introduced himself yet. Odilon Banneret, I thought you already knew. He figured now that she was playing games. After all, he knew that there was bounty, and she was clearly the half-demon who loved chasing them. His bounty had never stated his name, yet it didn't matter. Hearing that name seemed to break free memories she had thought long dead. Banneret. That's the name of the swordsman the Dark Ones fear. It was half musing to herself. Her eyes continually flickered between a gentle gaze and some ice-cold sensation within them. Her mixed emotions seemed to drag bits of her own appearance alongside them. Any other name would have made her happy. Any other name would have brought her a sense of freedom. No, it had to be... Why did it have to be this? Is this the child? He's far too young. She was now more angry than ever, though. Of course she failed to save the king. She thought she failed to save his son, and now this mockery. That was who she'd been reminded of. That was why he seemed so familiar. Why did it have to be him? How did this come full circle, with the only heir to the throne of their land standing right in front of her again? The voice within screamed to honor her old oaths, and she knew this was not going to end anytime soon. Her freedom was now gone. She had to fulfill her purpose instead.